Welcome to today's Explainer. We're jumping right into a fascinating case study in microecosystem management, straight from a fish-keeping blog by a writer named Ang. It's titled Notes on Fishkeeping, Part 297. And you know, what starts out as just routine aquarium maintenance actually turns into this wild story about an environmental crisis, some clever aquatic engineering, and underwater romance. So, let's dive right in and see exactly how a little human intervention can completely reshape a tiny enclosed world.
Picture this. You walk up to your carefully curated fish tank, right? You're expecting to see your fish just swimming happily around their home. But instead, you see something bizarre. You look closer, and the fish are all hovering right at the surface of the water, and they're completely vertical. Well, that is exactly the mystery our blogger faced. In a closed aquatic ecosystem, behavior like that, it's basically a giant flashing red warning sign. It's the fish's way of literally sounding the alarm that something in their environment has gone terribly, terribly wrong. The atmosphere has fundamentally shifted, and they are desperately gasping for relief at the very top of their world.
So what actually caused this sudden aquatic emergency? Well, it turns out the threat came from the outside. The culprit was just simple human error, basically overfeeding. During the week, Ang had been working on decluttering the tanks, but at the same time, way too much food was being dropped in. And those extra unfinished fish pellets, they didn't just magically disappear. Nope. They sank straight to the bottom and just sat there, rotting. It's crazy to think about how something as innocent as, trying to make sure your pets are well fed can accidentally trigger a total meltdown of the delicate environmental balance inside the tank.
All of that excess biological waste leads to what we call degraded water parameters. Now, in plain English, this just means a massive, severe drop in the aquarium's water quality. The tank is a closed system, right? So it just gets completely overwhelmed by those rotting pellets. The effect is toxic, literally. The water basically becomes polluted by the exact nutrients that were meant to keep the fish alive. And that toxic environment is exactly what led directly to that crazy vertical hovering behavior we just talked about.
Now, you might be thinking, hey, don't aquariums have natural defense mechanisms against this sort of thing? And well, yeah, they do. This specific tank actually had a built-in natural cleanup crew, aquatic plants and snails. Under normal circumstances in a balanced ecosystem, these guys are fantastic for keeping things neat and tidy. But here's the really critical lesson Ang noted. While snails and plants are super helpful, they definitely have their limits. When they're up against heavy overfeeding and a massive pile of decaying pellets, this natural cleanup crew is just completely outgunned. The biological load was simply way too heavy for them to handle.
Since the natural defenses were totally overrun, a mechanical solution was absolutely necessary. The intervention? A major, thorough water change. But our blogger didn't just stop at swapping out the water. Actually, this whole crisis prompted a complete rethinking of the fish enclosure itself. Drawing on months of experience trying to create the ultimate breeding setup for these dwarf cichlids, Ang decided to take this mandatory cleaning and turn it into a total habitat reset. It wasn't just about fixing the bad water anymore. It was about totally redesigning the world these fish live in to prevent future disasters and hopefully encourage some better outcomes.
And this required a pretty radical transformation. You see, the old setup was complex. It was cluttered with debris that would just get trapped in all these multiple hiding spots and artificial caves. The new setup, it pivots hard to intentional minimalism. We're talking stripping away all the clutter to leave just three things: one terracotta pot, a bag of coral substrates, and a sponge filter. It's a complete 180. We're going from a totally chaotic environment to a highly controlled, incredibly simplified one.
Let's actually break down the deliberate process of rebuilding this environment step by step. First up, we've got a single terracotta pot. This acts as the one and only artificial cave. It provides just enough shelter for the fish without creating a huge maze where debris can secretly hide. Second, a bag of coral substrates is brought in as the new foundation. And finally, step 3, a sponge filter is added to the mix. So, why these specific choices? Well, because they directly attack the root of the previous crisis. The sponge filter specifically ensures much better water quality and crystal clear visibility. It literally fixes the exact issues of clutter and degraded water that kicked off this whole saga in the first place.
Okay, but here is the really crucial point. Check out the sheer scale of the water change required to pull off this reset. 90%. Just think about that for a second. Removing and replacing 90% of the water isn't just a routine Sunday cleaning. That is a massive, massive environmental shock to the system. In an instant, it fundamentally alters the chemistry, the temperature, the entire feel of that micro ecosystem.
For the fish living inside, their world has practically been turned completely upside down and replaced in just a matter of moments.
But this massive shift actually builds into something truly extraordinary. Ang notes that a water change of this magnitude actually simulates a rainy season. This is just a brilliant twist of biomimicry. Out in the wild, heavy rains completely change river and lake environments. They flush out the old water and bring in a huge rush of fresh, cooler water. So, by changing out 90% of the tank's water, the human caretaker is literally playing Mother Nature. They are controlling the weather inside the tank, entirely tricking the biology of the fish by replicating a major wild weather event right there in the living room.
So why exactly would you want to simulate a rainy season? Well, because it acts as a very powerful biological trigger. In the wild, the arrival of the rainy season is basically a giant green light for fish. It signals that it's the absolute best time for breeding, since resources are suddenly everywhere. By creating this artificial monsoon through that huge water change, the specific goal is to induce this pair of dwarf cichlids to mate. The physical action of pouring in new water is directly tied to a really deep biological purpose. That habitat reset, it wasn't just about cleanliness at all. It was a highly calculated move to kickstart the breeding season.
But, as with all matters of romance, things do not always go according to plan, even when you literally control the weather. Ang observes a pretty humorous dynamic playing out in the new tank. It's basically a case of the unrequited nudge. The male dwarf cichlid has been persistently swimming up and nudging the female for a while now. He clearly got the biological memo to mate. But the female? Yeah, completely uninterested. She is entirely unbothered by his advances, which is making it pretty tough for this couple to actually get together, despite the absolutely perfect rainy season simulation going on around them.
And that brings us to the ultimate question as we wrap up today's explainer. We've watched this microecosystem go from a toxic crisis to a pristine, minimalist reset, all perfectly engineered to trigger natural instincts. But hey, nature has a mind of its own. Will this meticulously designed new habitat, with its single terracotta pot and perfectly clean water, finally spark romance between these two fish? Or is our persistent male cichlid just entirely out of luck? It really is a fascinating reminder that while we can manage the environment, we can't always control the inhabitants. So what do you think will happen next in Ang's tank? Keep that in mind as you think about the incredibly delicate balance of the ecosystems all around us.